It's the spring of 1977, and a powerful Genovese earner left his Englewood, New Jersey home, drove towards a cafe on Broome Street in Little Italy, and just vanished. Within days, six-figure ransom calls arrived. Within weeks, newspapers linked his disappearance to a larger spasm of mob violence, and within months, the Genovese family's leadership facade looked tighter than ever. Today, we're going to unpack what we actually know and what we'll probably never know about the disappearance of Carmine Eli, better known as Eli Joe the Baker Zeccardi. This is Real Mob Stories with James Proctor, and without further delay, on to our feature presentation. Carmine Eli Zeccardi was born around 1910 and was nicknamed Joe the Baker. And this nickname was a label that stuck because of his family's association with Caffè Roma, which was a pastry and espresso shop at 385 Broome Street. Caffè Roma itself dates back to 1891 when it was started out as P. Ronca and Brothers, aka Caffè Ronca, and was considered the Sardi's of Little Italy. The Zeccardi family was connected to it by mid-century, and it's still associated with the location, even today. The point here isn't culinary nostalgia, it's geographic. Broome and Mulberry has historically been Neapolitan territory and the epicenter of Little Italy. By the 1970s, Eli lived in Englewood, New Jersey, but he operated in and around Little Italy. That dual footprint, Jersey residence, lower Manhattan business, was actually typical for Genovese earners who straddled numbers, loans, and legitimate fronts. Eli himself was physically a small guy, only 5'5" tall, and weighed around 135 pounds. Eli was a big part of the Genovese sphere in lower Manhattan, in Little Italy and the adjacent East Side neighborhoods. And this was an area that had a lot of policy, loan sharking and gambling, and it supplied steady cash and control for the Genovese families. And there's two important items that I want to mention about Zeccardi. One, he had real money responsibilities. He was running numbers, loans, feast site rents, and vendor insurance. And he also had proximity to the cafes, the feast streets, and the small businesses that had made Little Italy a reliable machine for decades for Genovese collections. We know that Eli was made in the 1950s before the books were closed, and that by 1970 he had become a capo regime. By the mid-1970s, he was on the law enforcement radar, and sources described him as a kingpin in the loan sharking area and said he also had a history of involvement in illegal gambling. He was said to be a rising figure in the Genovese family. And you can't make sense of Zeccardi without the Genovese family's governance model from the late 60s through the 1980s. You see, Vito Genovese was sent to prison in 1959, and the family leadership secretly established a ruling panel to run the family in his absence. And this first panel included acting boss Tommy Ryan Ebele, underboss Gerardo Jerry Catena, and Catena's protege Benny Squint Lombardo. After Genovese died in 1969, Lombardo was named his successor. However, the family appointed a series of front bosses to masquerade as the official family boss, and the aim of these deceptions was to protect Lombardo by confusing law enforcement as who the true leader of the family was. Law enforcement thought Tommy Ryan Ebele was a boss, and then Funzi Thierry was a boss, and later Fat Tony Salerno. But the reality was that Lombardo was the boss of the Genovese family from Genovese's death in 1969 until 1981 when he stepped down due to health issues. So where does Eli sit in this structure? Several later leadership tables built from law enforcement understandings and insider accounts list Carmine Little Eli Zeccardi as a front or administrative figure in the early to mid 1970s. Sometimes he's called the underboss, sometimes an acting or front boss. But we know by 1976, Zeccardi was described as a top Genovese player rooted in Little Italy's revenue base, and he was trusted enough to be targeted in elite circles. We know that a confidential informant reported to the FBI that on the afternoon of July 28, 1976, Eli Zeccardi, underboss in the Genovese family, was going to meet with Genovese capos who frequented the Lower East Side. And they were to meet at the Caffè Roma, which is owned by Zeccardi, to discuss new members being made into the family. And then we also know that in the spring of 1977, Zeccardi and Funzi Thierry led an induction ceremony at an apartment in East Harlem where several Genovese men got their button, including George Barone. Now let's widen the lens. Let's look at 1977. So the spring of 1977 in New York City was marked by two overlapping realities. First, there was a professional mob hit style that had become common. Basically, you had a team of assassins, or an assassin with 22 caliber pistols with silencers. And investigators had linked a slate of recent gangland executions to that method. And then second, there was a kidnap for ransom strategy that was circled around high-earning bookmakers and loan sharks. So if you knew a man could control cash and he was reachable, a kidnapping could be a blunt instrument. Of course, it was criminal, risky, and sometimes freelance, but it was happening frequently. Overlay that criminal atmosphere onto a city already anxious about random violence. Remember, the son of Sam would be captured in August of 1977, but the sense of menace was part of 1977's texture. So against that background, a disappearance inside the Genovese orbit was guaranteed to generate both headlines and rumors. So let's actually discuss the documented timeline of Zeccardi's disappearance and what we know. So it's Wednesday, April 27, 1977, and Carmine Zeccardi leaves his Englewood, New Jersey home. His stated destination, per law enforcement accounts and later given to reporters, was Caffè Roma, which was on 385 Broome Street in the Little Italy section of Manhattan. We know that Zeccardi never returns. Roughly 3 days later, the Zeccardi family receives ransom calls demand a six-figure payment, well over $100,000 in some New York newspaper reports, but $200,000 is a figure cited by one national recap later in May. And we're also told that Zeccardi's family did pay the ransom. And then the following week, after the ransom was paid and Zeccardi didn't return, Zeccardi's wife contacts FBI's Newark, New Jersey office to report the abduction. And then by mid-May of 1977, which was about 2 weeks after his disappearance, the case surfaces in the New York newspapers with a handful of details repeated across stories. The April 27 disappearance, the Englewood to Broome Street itinerary, the ransom demands, and the FBI notification. And then also that same month, newspapers also discussed the near simultaneous disappearance of Dominic DeQuartero, also known as Dom the Sailor, who was described as a close associate of Zeccardi. We know, obviously, later that Dom the soldier reappears, but at the time, he was considered missing. So national coverage was packaging these two vanishings together, and it explicitly raised the possibility of an internal Genovese realignment. We also know that no bodies ever recovered, no kidnap teams brought to trial, and after May of 1977, Joe the Baker Zeccardi's presumed dead. So do we know what really happened, though? Only thing we've got are theories of what happened, and that's what I want to talk about. So the first theory, and the one that I consider most plausible, and I call it an internal realignment. So this theory sees Eli's disappearance as part of a Genovese house cleaning, and this was during a period where Benny Squint Lombardo was explicitly showing hidden control. Some investigators tried to associate Zeccardi's disappearance of the murder of two men, Vincent Capone and Frank Chen, who had been considered potential witnesses in a New Jersey mob mob trial. Vincent Capone was shot in the summer of 1976 while his Cadillac was stopped at a traffic light in Hoboken, while Frank Chin, a professional wiretapper, was killed in 1977 in the basement parking lot of his Manhattan apartment. Laboratory tests reportedly show that both men were killed by the same 22 caliber pistol. One law enforcement officer said that he wouldn't entirely discount the possibility of Zeccardi's disappearance being related to a Genovese power struggle. And then you have Mickey Spillane, and Spillane claimed that Zeccardi was murdered. Spillane might have been right, because shortly after Zeccardi's trusted ally, Dom the Sailor de Corto, risks doing the same end. They said that Dom the Sailor was involved in the numbers games and loan sharking, which was Zeccardi's money, and he served as a bodyguard to Zeccardi. And they said that Dom the Sailor and Little Eli was supposedly caught stealing from the family and weren't kicking up enough. So while Zeccardi was taken out in this theory, Dom the Sailor was given a second chance, mainly due to Dom's father being respected. We're told that Zeccardi had friends and allies not only in the Genovese family, but other families as well. So it stands to reason the family would use the kidnapping charade to protect themselves from other families or other guys looking for revenge. It's believed that Funzi Thierry, Dom Alonghi, and Chin Gigante pushed for Zeccardi's demise, with Fat Tony and Thierry taking it to Lombardo for permission. You see, Carmine Zeccardi was stepping on the backs or stepping on the toes of a lot of people. He was big into the numbers game. He was also going behind other members' backs in construction deals and was supposedly meddling in unions. Fat Tony made mention of the deals to an informant, but never implicated himself in Zeccardi's disappearance or any others that were involved. They said Zeccardi was alleged to have been ordering hits without permission from Lombardo, and he was meddling in some of the Jersey rackets, which was upsetting Funzi Thierry. So all these reasons are told for Zeccardi's disappearance, but we don't have any proof outside of what we're being told here. And then the second theory, I call it plausible but weaker, was that it was a freelance kidnapping. And this theory takes the ransom call at face value and positions a non-mob kidnapping crew targeting a known cash conduit. Also, you can add Zeccardi's heart condition, which was another detail present in the newspaper coverage. And the outcome could have been a death in captivity without a body and without a mob message. Although it's possible an independent kidnapping crew took Zeccardi, most investigators dismissed it, and I do too. Typically, the person would be returned or a body would actually show up. The ransom demands could have been a way to make law enforcement think that it was a kidnapping or it was somebody that knew about Zeccardi's disappearance and used the ransom demands as a way to take advantage of a scared family. So bottom line, the first theory, which is the internal realignment theory, to me best fits the Genovese strategy, the timing, and the post-1977 leadership changes. The freelance kidnapping model, it's not impossible, but it simply rests on fewer verifiable facts. So most likely this was an internal Genovese power move, and Zeccardi was on the short end of the stick. So what's the aftermath and the implications for the Genovese family? What changed because Eli disappeared? Well, not too much, because the front boss facade looked even more effective. In the years that followed, Funzi Thierry became the public face. Then you had Fat Tony Salerno occupying the bullseye, ultimately carrying the boss label into the commission case before a federal jury in the mid-1980s. Only after insider testimony came out did the wider public grasp that Benny Squint Lombardo and then Chin Gigante had been running the show with exquisite misdirection. So the operational machine in Little Italy, it kept humming. The disappearance of a higher earning administrator didn't crash the numbers or stop the loans from being collected. And that's really the hallmark of the Genovese system, which is continuity. If you disappear up front, someone else handles the envelopes the next morning. The feasts still run, the vendors still pay, and the loans still get collected. So we might not ever know what happened to Carmine Zeccardi, but his case is one where most likely he upset the wrong people and paid for it with his life. If you like today's show and story, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel so you'll never miss another episode of Real Mob Stories. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.